So today's class is the third part of a series of unknown length that we're going to talk about Jewish history. And what we're going to try to cover today is the story of the Second Commonwealth of Judea. We left off last time with we had the first temple built. It was really nice and wonderful for about 40 years. Right, and then Solomon dies, and his son makes a few poor political decisions. There's a secession, right? That becomes two kingdoms: the kingdom of Israel in the north, the kingdom of Judah in the south. The kingdom of Israel in the north, they don't have access to the temple, and they build their own temples. Unfortunately, they build temples to some other gods, and this repudiation of Judaism eventually ends with their being captured and dispersed by the Assyrians, and they're gone. We have no idea. We don't know where they are. In all likelihood, many of their citizens came down and joined the kingdom of Judah in the south, but they're gone. And then we have another 150, 170, 180, exactly the numbers, years, until finally the Babylonians, not the Assyrians, the great Babylonians come along, and they capture Jerusalem, and they send the Jews packing east. And from this point on in history until the 20th century, we're going to have a major and sometimes even the major center of Jewish life is going to be in Babylon. And where we ended off the story was that there's 70 years between the first and second temples. We have the whole story of the emergence of the Persian Empire and the story of Purim. Right, the Purim story, Mordechai, Esther, that story we're all familiar with. We have the Jews coming back initially to rebuild the temple. They get stopped by the Samaritans. We call them the not-so-good Samaritans, not the good Samaritans. The not-so-good Samaritans, who are known as Kusim, the people of unknown status, whether they're Jewish or not. Do they convert? Do they not convert? Do they convert genuinely or sincerely, or maybe not? That's a whole debate in the Talmud. You see every page of the Talmud talk about these people called the Kusim, which are the Samaritans, which are the people that replaced the Jews in the northern part of Israel. They were always in conflict with the rest of the mainstream Jewish community. They convinced the Persians to withdraw their support for the rebuilding of the temple, and it was halted, and then 15 years later was resumed under the leadership and stewardship of Ezra. That's where we ended off. We're talking about the year 350 before the Common Era. Everyone knows how the whole system before and after, which we work backwards. So we're talking about 2,400 years ago, and we have Ezra, a great leader. He comes to Israel from Babylon. He brings with him. Ironically, what he does is he brings with him the people of suspect status. It means he doesn't take all the best and brightest with him from Babylon. He takes the people that are kind of the weakest amongst the Jewish people. The way it's described in the Talmud is that he kind of purifies the Babylonian community. And because he was such a talented and successful leader, he felt like him, together with Nehemiah, they were able to develop and foster a very strong, vibrant community in Israel, but while leaving the community of Babylon to flourish. That's basically where we ended off. So what we're going to try to cover today is the whole period of the Second Temple period. We're going to meet the Greeks, of course. We're going to have the story of Hanukkah, and ultimately we'll deal with the Romans and hopefully the Christians, and etc. So that's the plan for today. Good?
All in an hour and a half.
Yeah.
All in an hour and a half. Okay, so there is a group of people called the Men of the Great Assembly. Everyone's heard of them? And they play a very pivotal role at the beginning of the Second Commonwealth period. And not only that, we kind of feel their role today in the Judaism that we have today. It kind of was shaped and molded by this body. So who was this body? We talked about last time, the previous time, we talked about the Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin is the supreme court of the Jewish people. It was established by, by Moses. Jethro established something else, which is he established a system, like a hierarchy system of appellate courts and stuff like that. But the actual Sanhedrin with the single group of Sanhedrin, which is 71 members plus 69 clerks, what do you call them, members in waiting, and they were established by Moses to adjudicate the people. It's the highest court of Jewish law. Now remember, the time of Moses, you don't really need a court to mediate differences in legal opinion. Why? Because you have Moses there, you have prophets there, you have Moses that could direct link with God. You have 700 years of prophets. We have prophets all the way down to Ezra. Right? So their role is not going to be that critical. Yes, there'll be a court, and a court, is very important body because you have legal cases that to have to try. But the other aspect of the Sanhedrin, which is not only to try the cases, but to mediate the legal differences, what we would perhaps say the Supreme Court today. It's not just about the actual case, but it's about the opinion. The opinion is much more important than the individual case because the opinion kind of sets the tone of what is and is not law. So that part of the Sanhedrin's responsibility is going to explode. Why? Because we have a downturn in prophecy. We kind of see the writing on the wall. These prophecies are fewer and fewer. There's not so many prophets around. The last of the prophets are Haggai and Malachi, and that's it. So at that time, you have the last of the prophets. So you know that there's going to come a point really in the really not so distant future where there's no more prophets. So what do you do now? Now if you don't have the right answer, you're toast. So the Sanhedrin's role is going to expand. And what Ezra is going to do, he's going to take this Sanhedrin and temporarily expand it from 70 members to 120 members, right? Called the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah. Knesset means assembly, HaGadolah means a large one. So men of the great assembly, large or great. The modern day Israel modeled their Knesset after the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah, the men of the great assembly. So they too also have 120 members in Israel's parliament.
How did they pick 120?
I don't know what the story was in the.
Did Moses live to be 120?
Yeah, it's a good number in Judaism, but it's 120 members. I don't know what the rationale was behind that. There's actually, interestingly, there's debates as to was it a continuously 120, or was just a group of 120 members, and then they didn't refresh those numbers. There's this one scholar that wrote a whole book claiming from Jewish sources, not like. That the men of the Great Assembly were just 120 individuals, and then when they died, they weren't replaced. So the last of their members was just the last remaining. So Shimon Atzanek, the name that we're associated with as the last or the remnant of the men of the Great Assembly, he was actually the last guy. But we have names, people like Ezra, for example. Daniel, Haggai, all these names. Mordechai was part of the Knesset Gadolah. The Zerubbabel, who led the first expedition back from Babylon, he was also a member of the Great Assembly. So what was that? So they're dealing now with a major shift. Probably, we could say, we could point to certain times in history where there's going to be a major change in the direction and kind of the way of life of the Jewish people. And thankfully, the Jewish people were always blessed with leaders that had foresight, and they were able to foresee what's going to happen. Later on in the story, read the writing of the Mishnah. The writing of the Mishnah. Now, to actually write down the Mishnah, we'll get to what the Mishnah is, and hopefully if you have time today, maybe we'll do it. But to write down the Mishnah, or to codify the Mishnah, to canonize the Mishnah, that's an act that's prohibited by Jewish law. Torah says oral law is called oral law because it's oral, hence the term. But if you go into any Jewish bookstop in the world, you can find copies of the oral law. Wait a minute, if it's oral, why is it written? So that was a decision made roughly 1,800 years ago by a fellow by the name of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Judah the Prince, otherwise known as Rabbi, just Rabbi. You open the Talmud and see a rabbi. Say, which rabbi? There's so many rabbis we're talking about. Just Rabbi is Rabbi Judah the Prince. And he was the leader of the people during one of the most tumultuous centuries in Jewish history, the second century of the Common Era, a time where we had what was the name of the? I'm trying to remember the name of the Roman emperor who became emperor in the year 117.
You forgot a fact.
Oh gosh, it starts with an H. I can't remember. So that was when they made prohibitions against study of Torah. Like, can you imagine, like the only way Jewish people survive is if the Torah survives. The second we lose our Torah, we lose our thing that makes us unique and special, and we're done. And what the Romans tell us, if you study Torah, if you have a Torah convention of any sort, we're gonna just slaughter all of you. That's what they did. So it was a very tumultuous and challenging time, especially when you take into account the local leaders and their prohibitions against Torah study, and dispersal amongst a multitude of places, and losing of the central authority, disbanding of the Sanhedrin. So he made this decision, and he saved Judaism. Ezra and the men of the Great Assembly kind of also were doing the same thing. They were dealing with a new reality, a new Judaism. Right? There's no longer are we going to have kings from monarchs, absolute rulers from the house of David. We'll meet the Hasmonean kings, but they weren't even legitimate kings because they were not from the tribe of Judah. They were Kohanim, as we know. We're going to have a Judaism has become a non-profit organization. No more prophets, no more direct link with God. We're going to have a second temple, which was basically a shell of the first temple. The vessels of the first temple, most of them weren't there, right? The famous ark from Raiders of the Lost Ark, we all know, right? So that ark was only in the first temple. So you have a temple of 400 years, and there's no ark. So one of the basic, fundamental vessels of the temple and the Holy of Holies, where the Kohen Gadol goes in Yom Kippur. And the second temple, all they had was a little stone, called Evan Shasias in the Mishnah and Yoma. Right? And there are those that say, that theorize, you have all these, that stone is the same stone in the Dome of the Rock. Problem is that according to the Mishnah, it says it was only 3 tvachim tall, which is yay tall, and the one on Temple Mount is about, 20 feet tall or something like that. So that's a question. But either way, it's a different temple. Right? There's no open miracles. There's corruption of the high priesthood. Right? They're going to start selling the high priesthood to the highest bidder. In the first temple we have 18 high priests. That's it, over about 400 years.
Quick question. So did the ark get taken by the?
So what happened to the ark? So there's different theories. Actually, the Talmud talks about what happened to the ark. It says that according to one theory, it was. Let's see, put this down here. According to one opinion in the Talmud, is with the Babylonians. They came, they ransacked, and they just took it. And according to the other opinion, is King Josiah, one of the last of the kings of the First Temple period. He hid it somewhere. And in fact, there's this legend that this one priest in the Second Temple, he saw this loose stone somewhere in the Temple Mount, and he moved it aside, and he saw the ark there, and he went and started telling his friend and died. That's the legend. Whether it happened or not is not clear. But either way, we don't know exactly where it is. It's gone.
Isn't there an archaeological frieze of the Arch of Titus?
Well, the Arch of Titus is talking about, that's the menorah.
The menorah, there is the ark not on there?
No, but remember, the menorah, in the Second Temple, they had the menorah.
Yeah.
And so that was one of the vessels they did have. And when Titus destroyed the Second Temple, the way the Romans did it is they established like this big monument, this ark, that we call the Arch of Titus, in Rome. And in it, it's etched in the stone. You can go see it today. It's etched a picture of them carrying this massive menorah.
Yeah.
So is that the menorah or not? Did the Vatican have it? Well, either way, clearly the Vatican doesn't have it because the Rome was sacked in the 6th century. So it's probably not there. But there are those that point out, if you look at the actual menorah on the Arch of Titus, if you look at it, you'll see that there's images on the base of the menorah. So the menorah has a base, and then it has the one, and then it comes out the menorah, right? So on the actual base of that, there are these images. And imagery is always linked with paganism. So, like the Ten Commandments says, don't make any images, because images are always linked with idolatry. So the notion that the temple vessel of the menorah would have images on its base is very strange. So there are lots of different theories. There are those that say that there were multiple menorahs. They had like a fake one and a real one, and they hid the real one, they left the fake one there. We had somewhat of a eccentric neighbor growing up, who he decided that the menorah was in the Vatican. He basically made a trip, and he went to the Vatican and was like, stood on the door like knocked and says, "Where's our menorah?" I don't know what he did, but he basically went on some sort of pilgrimage to go reclaim the menorah. Very bizarre.
He didn't get arrested.
He might have. I don't know. And he was eccentric. He still is, but he moved out.
So let me just ask a question, just to wind back a little bit. I guess modern anti-Semitism relates to Christianity and Gospels and that depiction of what happened to Jesus. But when we talk about the Romans and before Christianity and banning Torah reading and stuff, what was that? Did they see the Jews as a political threat or a military threat? Or were they just different, and so that's why the Romans passed those edicts? What was the basis?
You're saying but there's a premise in your question, right? What's the premise of the question? That anti-Semitism is only because of the claim of deicide. We killed their God, right? Which is bizarre if you think about it. Like, okay, if he's really a God and we killed him, then he probably has a say in the matter. Either way, but that's not the only reason why, or not the only excuse given for anti-Semitism. Non-Christians have also been really bad to the Jews over the past 1,000 years. There's other reasons given why Jews dominate the world, or Jews control the economy. Jews are different. Scapegoat theory. There's multiple different theories given as to why Jews are hated. And the Jewish theory as to why Jews are hated is that it has nothing to do with any of the excuses given, rather because it's a method of ensuring Jewish survival. That if Jews are beloved, well, then there's risk for assimilation. Right? That's the Jewish theory. And in fact, the Talmud says that Har Sinai, Mount Sinai, the word Sinai is very similar to the word Sin'ah. Sin'ah means hatred. And the Talmud says is that at the time of Mount Sinai, they got hatred. Which means that as at the formation, the establishment of the nation, there's something about a Jewish nation that was instilled or infused in the Jewish people at Sinai, this hatred, because as a safety gap, a safety measure to ensure that the Jewish people will forever remain an eternal nation and never lose their identity and lose their special status as a Jewish people. That's the Jewish theory. Now, as to why the Romans and the Greeks and the Babylon, I'm saying, you look at times where they banned. So let's say you start with Antiochus, right? Antiochus Epiphanes. He was the one who first made the ban against circumcision, against observing the Shabbat, against kosher laws of Jewish ritual purity, right? You study Torah, we're going to kill you, right? And that basically was the background that the Maccabean revolt was. That was the background. That was the story. They came after the Jewish people not only for their land and to conquer them, but also to control them religiously. Why he did that? So you could say that it wasn't necessarily out of anti-Semitism. It was out of an attempt to control them, or attempt to subjugate them, an attempt to assimilate them into Hellenism, because the Jews, being different, they always rebelled. Jews rebelled more than anyone. The Jews constantly rebelled. The Romans, 500 years of domination. No one had in human history, not before, not since, has there been an empire as dominant as the Romans. Not the United States, not Imperial England, no one, not the Ottoman, nobody. And the Jews rebelled more than anyone else. Jews revolted all the time. Right? The Jews were volatile. Today we think of Jews as being, like dentists and really calm, easygoing. The Jews were maniacs in ancient times. The Jews didn't care. They would go up. You look at the Maccabeans. They went up, according to the sources that we have from the Book of the Maccabees. They were outnumbered 4 or 5 to 1 in most battles. But they were animals. They were animals. They were crazy. They didn't care. They didn't care about dying. What are you going to do? That's like the most volatile subject you could possibly have. So a lot of the ancient attempts at restricting Jewish practice was also a method of ensuring kind of the viability of your own your own control and conquering of that nation. Because if the second you say Jews, we're no different than anyone else, like the Jews that unfortunately become Hellenized, we'll get to them, then they don't revolt, and you don't have to send. And the Romans had as many people controlling tiny Judea, as they had India, and we see this also in the British Mandate. They had in the 1940s. They had to dedicate so much resources to controlling Israel because the Jews were very prone to rebelling and to revolting and to terrorizing them, or legitimately or illegitimately, whatever the reason is. But that's the reality, and that's the way the Jews were. So yes, it could have been a religious ban, but it was also political. Politically, if you take the Jews and you make them Greek, you Hellenize them, well, then they'll be very happy that you control them. If you make them Roman, and that's what ancient empires, what they did. They came, they saw, and they conquered, right? They came, they conquered, and then they also infused the nation that they conquered, the subject nation, with their way of life. So they became Roman citizens and Roman subjects. And then what happens? They pay taxes and live and let live, and they live, and everything works. If you have a stubborn people, Jews are renowned for their stubbornness, that are. No, it's true. The Torah says. The Torah calls us a stiff-necked. We're a stiff-necked people. We're stubborn. The Jews rebelled against Moses many times. It's true, because we're stubborn. That's perhaps our best and perhaps also our worst quality.
Don't give up.
We don't give up. We're relentless. Right? We got that from Abraham. Abraham was stubborn. Abraham was relentless. Abraham didn't stop and say, "You know what? I'm facing so much opposition. Maybe I should just go live a quiet life." Become.
Such a violent group of people, but yet in the U.S. before 6-Day War or whatever, we were considered like meek and weak and bullied and beaten up all the time and that kind of thing.
Yeah, you could say that, but remember, we don't in the U.S. the Jews don't have a sense of nationalism, and it's within us.
Yes,
it's within us. So perhaps we're vocal about other things. We're vocal and we're relentless about other things as well. But it's within the Jewish character to fight for what you believe in. So in ancient times, that meant fighting for Jewish independence and Jewish survival and Jewish continuity, and that's what we did, and we did it ferociously.
You think that the Holocaust brought the Jewish community closer together?
What a question, huh?
Yeah, what a question.
Do I think that the Holocaust brought the Jewish community together? Well, I think that it shattered a fantasy of us just becoming like everyone else. It shatters the fantasy of the Jewish people not being different. Did it bring them together? I'm saying it's the most traumatic event to happen to our people probably ever. I'm saying up there with the slaughter at the hands of the Babylonians or the hands of the Romans, and being dispersed and being misplaced and being set out and exiled throughout the world. But it was a tragedy of epic proportions. Obviously, did some good come out of it? I'm saying you can legitimately argue that the state of Israel wouldn't have happened without the Holocaust. I think it's a legitimate argument. I'm saying obviously it's a sensitive topic.
How much of it is also behind the death is too strong a word, but I'm going to use it because I can't think of anything better. But the death or the weakening of Jewish practice and identity in the U.S. and in other parts of the world. Like you look at Europe and the Holocaust, wiped out Judaism in some countries completely, and then you have so many people in the U.S. and in the Western world who come from strong Jewish families who then became basically the lost generation of Jews who raised children not practicing Judaism. And then there was the offshoot of all of the non-Orthodox movement.
Yeah, but remember,
and the growth of,
but that's
like,
not
more liberal
that's not
Judaism.
after, that's not post-Holocaust. That's 19th century.
Yeah.
The worst century in probably all of Jewish history for Jewish assimilation was the 19th century.
Yeah.
You had wholesale assimilation, wholesale conversion to Christianity. Those things that were never even. You always had rebels, but it was never on such a wide scale. So
What happened at that time? Like, what's the reason?
maybe we'll get there. I'm saying it's okay. It's okay. It's a good question. It's a legitimate question. But as we know, like if you have the gift of retrospect in history, if you're able to see a 200-year view of what's happening, right, you're able to gain much more perspective. If it was 1844, and we were in Brunswick, Germany, right, and we would be having this discussion, we wouldn't be able to see clearly what's actually happening. But because we don't see the factors, and we don't see how, we don't have that that broader vision. Now we could say there's a whole bunch of things that kind of collided, and history is a build-up. Big major events in history happen as a result of build-up that could take off in 100 years. So at the time you don't see it. But we talk about, let's say, the destruction of the Second Temple. We talk about it as a build-up of sinat chinam. The Talmud says, why was the Second Temple destroyed? Sinat chinam. Costless hatred of one Jew to another. And if you look at it now, we already see, from 200 years before the destruction of the Second Temple, we already see factionalism, sectarianism, infighting, discord amongst the Jewish people internally that ultimately brings about the Romans destroying the temple after the Great Revolt, the year 66, right? But now we can see that. Now we have that perspective. Similar thing, we talked about the 19th century being a challenging, very challenging. It was a buildup in the 17th and 18th century. What happened to the Jewish people internally, but also what happened to the rest of the world, right? We have the Renaissance bringing upon the Enlightenment, and Jewish people were overnight granted citizenship. They were allowed to own land. They were not, at least not from a governmental standpoint, they weren't marginalized socially or economically. You allowed to go to universities. You allowed to go live in England. Ain't that nice, right? So overnight, the Jewish people were just granted access to everything that the secular world has to offer. No longer were they confined to ghettos. No longer were they restricted from owning land or from engaging in many practices. So there's obviously, we used to be Jews. We're different. We look different. We dress different. We have different practices. We have to speak different religion. We speak a different language, right? The Jewish people spoke Yiddish. And now suddenly we're allowed to do whatever we want. The world is open to us. A lot of people took that as but we can't go to the universities looking all different, looking all weird. Let's meet them halfway. Let's be a little bit, more liberal with, or liberal with our acceptance of secular influence, of non-Jewish influence, and let's change our names and change our identity and this and then. Eventually, that leads to wholesale rejection of Jewish identity. That's just that's the basic progression of what happened. It can only be accepted if I'm a Christian. Okay, I'll become a Christian. And I'm saying that's also predicated on the fact that internally, perhaps the Jewish communities themselves didn't do enough to foster a feeling of, a special feeling of what it means to be Jewish. If we don't tell our kids how special it is to be Jewish, on one hand, on the other hand, they see that, hey, this club is only open to non-Jews. Or, this is, if I come with my kippah, my tzitzit, they're going to look at me strange. If those two things kind of go together, you don't know why you're Jewish. You don't know why it's special, what it means, the value of being Jewish. And being Jewish is going to hinder your development or your progress or your opportunity in the greater world. Well, then, in all likelihood, you'll make that decision to reject it. Why would you tenaciously hold something that's just you don't accord any value or little value to, and it's preventing you from doing what you want to do?
So where do you
what do you think is our biggest challenge now with anti-Semitism, particularly in Europe? I mean, I read articles all the time about what's going on over there, and it's actually
Scary.
quite
Yes,
frightening.
it
Yeah.
is.
The French
I mean,
are
it's
40-some hundred, over 4,000 French are leaving.
They've already immigrated to
No,
Israel.
but there's still about 600,000 French Jews.
Yeah, what's clear
But
to
they have-
us
the
from
billionaires are coming to the United. There was an article where they had like 57 billionaires, French billionaires coming to the United States that were emigrating. to the
A
United
lot have gone to Israel also.
Oh,
Israel, yeah, but these were the billionaires. These were the richest people, the
Well,
richest
these guys
Jews.
weren't
I just
bikers,
read
I
it
can
like
tell
a
you.
month
yeah,
ago.
well, a lot of I'm saying also there's the French they're raising the taxes on everyone. They're going
Yeah,
you
well,
know,
I mean, that's a different.
they're going
that's a
to
financial-
yeah they're embracing
But I met-
socialism.
When I was in my travels, I've met some French Jews. There's a lot of it.
Yeah, they don't want. They're scared to walk around with kippahs. They have to have guards by their synagogues. I'm saying it's crazy. I'm saying to me, the way I see it is that yes, Europe is no longer hospitable for Jews. It isn't.
It's an interesting.
It wasn't really that hospitable to begin with.
Interesting story. When I was about 5 years ago, I was in Italy, and we met this Jewish family from Munich.
Yeah,
And his father was in the Holocaust. He was Polish.
yeah.
And after the Holocaust went back to Poland, there was so much anti-Semitism, he moved to Munich and raised his family there. There were, 5 years ago, there were about 8,000 Jews in Munich. There are 100,000 Jews in Germany now.
No, there's a lot of Jews. A lot of Russian Jews moved to
Yeah,
Germany.
mostly Russian Jews. Yeah.
The last program in Poland was in 1968.
That's pogrom.
Program.
Well, who knows if there haven't been any since that we don't know about.
One of the things I see now, though, and I don't know that it's necessarily different, but it's just on my radar, and that is a lot of the anti-Semitism is not, there is not a major pushback between the leaders of these countries. I mean, we've seen several things recently in Belgium that just really surprised me. Other countries as well, but it's not low-level people that they may be the ones that are doing the violence, but I don't see a big pushback from the leaders of these
Yeah, I'm saying
That's really where
you look at.
I'm
I'm saying you look at the United Nations. What it is basically is United Nations against Israel, right? That's what it is. If not for the United States,
Did you read?
even
But
I'm saying it's a reality.
okay,
You know,
but we
it's
don't have to
this,
go. First off, we don't. The United States was. We don't have to go back that far. You can go back to the 40s and 50s, and until the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. Harvard, Princeton, all the Ivy Leagues, they had hard quotas on Jews.
When I went to med
Jews
school,
couldn't
we
join
had a
certain
high
country clubs in this country. That's why they had to have their own resorts in the Catskill Mountains in
Yeah.
upstate New York.
Yeah.
So we don't have to go back
not-
that far. Now, there wasn't murderous genocide of Jews in the United States, but this country, from a social and educational aspect, was not that hospitable to Jews. And we don't have to go back 30. We don't have to go back 30 years
That is very
to find example after example
true.
after example of
Yeah.
that. Now, what that
That's
caused, when those barriers went down, Jews didn't have, there were deed restrictions and other things
Yeah.
like that. Jews could move out of certain areas in Baltimore and Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. They could live in certain neighborhoods. Whether that's good or bad and what that resulted to, but this country was not all that hospitable to Jews, and it wasn't until the laws were changed to outlaw those sorts of behaviors, and that wasn't until the 1960s. So,
Yes, but you
so
have-
this United States was not this panacea from 1776. I know nobody's saying that, but they're
Yeah.
creating this impression here.
yeah, but still comparatively.
So anti-Semitism
Yeah.
preserves Judaism.
Well, that's
a theory.
that's a theory presented in the Talmud, and every other theory you're going. This I think there's officially like 6 or 9. I remember different theories as to why anti-Semitism exists, and every single example has a counterexample where that factor wasn't true. Jews are super wealthy. Well, even the Jews were super poor, they were hated. Jews are super poor. Well, even the Jews are super wealthy, they face anti-Semitism. Non-Christian countries that don't have the reason of genocide. The idea of a scapegoat itself is a proof that there's no actual reason; it's just an excuse, right? Jews control the world's economy. It's nonsense. I'm saying these are excuses.
We have
We're racially different, but
we have for the small percentage that we are 2% now in the country, or the less. Who knows? We have a tremendous amount of influence.
but remember that is not limited to, the United States today. It's been throughout history, when Jews were granted the opportunity, they always rose to the top. We say that that's Abraham's influence, right? Abraham's blood that's within ourselves, which is, like we said, the persistence, the determination, but also not being, being driven and not being content with the status quo. Seeing the world in a different way. Being creatively intelligent and trying to imagine a different world.
Have you read the Promised Land by Ari Shavit?
No.
It's about Israel from 1897 on. I mean, I'm reading it now because he's going to speak on the 16th at the JCC. And you see, we weren't the nicest people in Israel in the 30s and 40s.
What do you mean?
This is the way we treated the Arab population.
Yeah, well, the way we treated each other. There was so much infighting amongst the different groups, the Haganah and the Irgun, and they were bombing each other. And, the tragic story of the Altalena, the Irgun and the Haganah ostensibly had the same mission, which is to establish a state, but they were at such, they were banging with each other, it was basically a civil war. And the Irgun arranged for a ship loaded with weapons and it was rifles and tons of stuff that would have helped them in their underground battle. And they shot cannons and they sunk the ship, and all the people that were swimming to shore, they were shooting. It's Jews killing Jews. It's the greatest disaster in history, Terrible things happen like that, yes. And, what did David Ben-Gurion say about that story? HaTotach HaKadosh, he said. HaTotach HaKadosh, which means the holy cannon. He said that the cannon that destroyed the ship is the holy cannon, and it should be enshrined in the third temple. That's what David Ben-Gurion said. So yes, is that an example of factionalism and sectarianism amongst the Jewish people themselves? Absolutely. And is that tragic? Absolutely.
Against the Arab population, they were...
Yeah, generally they were fair, and generally, we love to poke holes at the way we treat other people, but the way we get treated is always worse, always. Either way, let's get back to the Men of the Great Assembly here. So we see a changing Judaism. We see a Judaism. It's not going to have a temple. It's not going to have prophets. It's not going to have kings from the family of David. They're going to also see a Judaism now where you're going to have two concurrent communities. You're going to have a community in Babylon and a community in Israel. No longer, I guess for the rest of the time, basically, even to this day, no longer are we going to have the majority of Jewish people living in Israel. I think that's, I don't know, I don't believe we're there yet. But we always had, the majority of Jews were always together in the United States at the times of Moses and Joshua. Now, the majority of Jews are living elsewhere. So what this body was entrusted was with the responsibilities of creating this Judaism that's going to survive throughout the history. So the first most important thing that they did was to ensure that the Oral Torah will exist and continuously exist over exile and chaos. There's going to be a lot of turmoil, and the way the Jews are going to survive is if they have this kind of portable homeland, which is the way of life, of what it means to be Jewish, right? Which we call the Oral Torah. We see this pattern again and again. Whenever the Jewish people are threatened, they're threatened primarily with losing their identity as Jews, losing the Torah, losing the Oral Torah. Right? The written Torah is documented. Take it with you. But the way of life, the actual way of how Jews live,
make practice impossible.
Exactly. And the second we lose that, then we're done. Because especially when we're in exile. So that's what we see the emergence of the Sanhedrin as being as a focal point of Jewish central leadership. Yeah.
Is it not Ezra? Isn't he the one that tells Jewish men to leave their non-Jewish wives?
Yes. There's a story of 112. There were 100.
I was always bothered by that story.
There was 112. 112. He came back to Israel. And there's 112 men that were intermarried. It's like to us in America today, where the vast majority of Jews intermarry, it's like nothing. But that's what it's talking about. It was a very small amount of Jews, and he told them, he said, he encouraged them to, you're Jewish,
But he also encouraged them to leave their children behind.
Is that right?
It's my understanding that he says to leave those wives and those children behind. I can understand that you should leave the wife behind, but these are your How do you do that?
I'm
That's your next generation.
Yeah, but
Well, that's the problem.
90% of the time,
They go
if
with the
they well, but if they've got a non-Jewish mother, you're not going to have Jewish kids. You know, because and my apology. Well,
And I
obviously,
also-
I'm not trying to offend
yes.
anybody, but 90%.
I also think
of
it was
the
a different time.
the-
It was a
the-
different time. You know.
But I mean, I think even today, like the woman will shape the home and will shape the children, and if she's not on board, those kids are not gonna be
I would be
raised in that.
fighting them every step of the way.
Yeah, but I think that's why. And then I think also you're looking at a time where they're still practicing polygamy. Women and children are treated more as property than as people, just generally speaking, and that's kind of how the system is. And so if you've got 4 wives and 3 or 4 kids, it's not per wife. It's not like you're going to have the same kind of family relationships that you would have today. You know, how much time did you spend with them? And even though it's unfortunate to just lop a couple off and leave them behind, but honestly, but it is. But people do this into the modern era. Like this, and honestly, this happens all the time. It just doesn't look the same way because we're not looking at it with hindsight. But yeah, it's mean, but it makes sense.
So
You're such a practical girl.
No, but there are
You
families
don't
where
put
the
your
men
feelings in it,
are
you know.
Jewish, where they raise the kids Jewish. I mean, we
It
have some.
happens.
We have
It can, yeah. I mean, it does
Trump,
happen. But
Ivanka. Well, she converted,
yeah,
and I think Clinton's kids are.
She did not convert.
No, but I think he's a traditional Jew. I think the kids being raised Jewish. Well,
either way, so one of the things that the Men of the Great Assembly did. No way, we're getting through this all today. Codifying the Siddur, prayer, right? They formalized prayer, the prayer that we have today with the Amidah and everything. Oh, that's the product of the Men of the Great Assembly. Why did they do that? What was it before then? Remember, prayer is a mitzvah in the Torah. One of the 613 mitzvahs in the Torah is to pray. According to Maimonides, it means to pray every day. According to Nachmanides, it means to pray at times of need. Either way, there's a Torah mitzvah, commandment to pray. What they did was they made a formalized, structured the prayer. They made that now everyone prays together, communal prayer, every day at set times. And the reason why they did this was, number one, because the Jewish people relaxed and say, "Oh yeah, of course I pray, but not every day or whatever." People weren't kind of fulfilling it in the ideal sense, because in the ideal sense, prayer is man talking to God. That's it. What language? Whatever language they're comfortable with. What do they say? Whatever they're feeling. That's what prayer is really all about, and that prayer still exists. But they mandated that at least a formalized prayer will happen every day, because because otherwise some people wouldn't pray at all. Additionally, they did this prayer as a compensation for the loss of sacrifices. They modeled the prayers after the sacrifices in the temple, so that the Jews who were in Babylon, they're far away from the Jewish central leadership, basically, in Jerusalem. The whole temple is this idea that maybe they'll make a pilgrimage, hopefully they'll make a pilgrimage, but they have their own life. And Judaism and its ideal is when the Jewish people are united in Israel, and they have a temple, and the temple kind of serves as the epicenter of the Jewish world. So what they did is they formalized the prayer in the way that during the prayer you're basically mimicking what's happening at the temple concurrently. And that the Jewish people throughout the world until this day, we have that association with the temple, because the morning prayer corresponds to the morning sacrifices, afternoon prayer, evening prayer. On Shabbat we have the Musaf prayer, and we talked about, we kind of basically try to relive what it was like in the temple.
So during the temple years, there was prayer every day. I mean,
First and second temple, we were talking about.
Yeah, first. We'll start with the first.
Well, yeah, but it wasn't formalized.
Okay.
It wasn't formalized.
So
everyone was praying on their own. Okay. Everyone was doing whatever. Everyone was praying in their own form, in their own language, by themselves.
But you have the central temple.
Yeah, the central temple was a uniting force, and the Jewish people all lived there. So it was, it was much. They were much more united.
And constant sacrifice all day long.
Well, yeah, but there's also the morning, then the afternoon.
Yeah.
what the men of the Grand Assembly tried to do was create a thriving people out of the ashes of what was Judaism in its ideal sense. Now,
Period, kind of.
we're talking about the year 350, basically.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, before the Common Era. With formal prayer, you say, wait a minute, I'm going to say the same prayer, the same words every day, multiple times a day for decades. What they tried to do was create kind of like the multivitamin. They created a prayer that has all the aspects, all the facets of man's relationship and man's requests from the Almighty, and there's also room to ad-lib. So say whatever you want, kind of insert your own prayers, your own language. That's always encouraged. I always tell people, forget about the prayer book, forget about the Talit, forget about the synagogue, forget about Hebrew. Prayer means talking to God like you would talk to your fellow, like you would talk to your friend. You would confide in your friend. You would seek the advice of your friend. You would kind of pour out your heart to a friend you're close with. Do that to God. Right? God is your billionaire dad who wants nothing more than having a relationship with you. Right? He wants you to ask you for what you need. He wants to develop a relationship with you. That's what it is. So if you're in your car and the radio went to commercial break, turn it off and talk to God in English. You're walking from your cubicle to the water cooler, talk to God. In what language? In the language you're most comfortable with. God understands English probably as well as you do. So that's prayer. Another major thing that they did, canonization of the Jewish Bible. We're reaching the point in time where prophets are not going to exist any longer. How many prophets were there? According to the Talmud, there were millions of prophets. And probably lots of prophets wrote lots and lots of documents. So Jewish people always literate, Jewish people always writing, Jewish prophets always castigating. What do you have? We have to create this one corpus of Jewish writings. Right? So what they did is they canonized the Torah, the Tanakh, the Bible. So they had to sift through and edit, and kind of the best job that they did was to go through everything and find, the prophets that are most applicable. The three major prophets, right? Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and Isaiah, and that became part of the corpus of the Jewish books, and everything else was not included in the Bible. The last book that they included was the book of Esther. Esther was a book that was written by Mordechai, who was a member of this great body as well. It was only 15 years earlier we written the book, and that was the last one that was included. You have like the book of the Maccabees, which is also a book written by it was chronicling the story of Hanukkah, that was written, about 180 years later. Well, I don't know if we know exactly who wrote it. It was written 180 years later, but that was already after the books were already set in stone, and it wasn't included. It's part of the Christian Bible, because the Christian Bible kind of incorporates everything. Old Testament.
It's in the Catholic Bible.
Okay, sorry, Catholic Bible. Sorry, then and the Jewish Bible became like kind of the Old Testament, and then there's the New Testament. You want the New Testament? Ooh.
There's going to be a speaker at this book fair about those things that didn't get into the Bible that they're not in Scripture that should have been.
Well, so there were other things that weren't included, like the book of Ben Sira, the book of Ben Sira, which,
The Book of Enoch.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm sure there were probably hundreds of books, but the Talmud always talks about this book of Ben Sira. It was this very interesting, bizarre book that the Talmud has like this tormented relationship with, because on one hand it kind of like brings it in a positive light, the other hand it talks kind of negative. But it was a very popular book. It was a Jewish book of Jewish origin, but they decided deliberately not to include it in the Jewish Bible. So that was the decisions of these groups. Now, also at this point in time, once we no longer have prophets, we no longer have kind of basically united Israel in Israel, with great strong leadership. We're going to also open up our community, our people, our nation to schisms, to offshoot religions, to breakaways, to people kind of rejecting basic tenets of Judaism. Most popular amongst those is rejection of the Oral Torah. The rabbis invented it all. It's all an invention. So we meet like the Sadducees. We're going to meet them really soon. They were a group of people who came from a student of Antigonos Ish Sokol. He was the Nasi. He was the president of the Jewish people. He was the Av Betin. He was the probably what we call the chief justice of the Sanhedrin. And he had these two students. One of them, his name was Tzadok. One of them, his name was Baitos. And they rejected each on their own kind of his teachings. And they said, oh, the rabbis invented it, the whole thing. There's no life after death. Like, there's no soul. There's no immortality. And there's no consequences. And all we have is a written Torah. And that's a common schism. We see this again and again, where you have kind of the breakaways from the mainstream, whether it be the Essenes, we'll meet them a little later, the Sadducees, we'll meet them right now, the Karaites of the 9th century, they kind of all follow the same model, not to reject the actual written Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and that whole narrative, and that whole, all those, they embrace that. What they do is reject what they would call the Oral Torah, kind of the interpretation of that. So that's why if you ever see anyone wearing tefillin between their eyes, like that, because it says you wear tefillin between your eyes. Right? You should put your tefillin between your eyes.
That's the way I wear it because it's loose. I don't know that's the damn thing. And I've been doing that for 60 years.
That's hilarious. But tefillin were always worn over here, between your eyes, which means centered. Between your eyes, right? But on top of your head. What they say is they take it in the literal sense. So they were weird tefillin like this.
I was in an airplane with the chief rabbi of Israel, this is
Who's this?
Years ago. I don't know.
Rabbi Lau?
I don't remember now what his name, but anyway, he's moving. You get up in the morning and everybody runs to the front of the airplane, and he's moving right still.
Oh, that's hilarious. That's fantastic.
That was right after a big Jerusalem shooting. Everybody was on the plane the next day.
Was it?
There was a massacre. I forget how many, but it was
The Lord Airport Massacre.
In 1993, Rabbi Israel Meir Lau became the chief rabbi, the Ashkenazi chief rabbi. In 2003, it's always 10-year increments. 2003, Rabbi Yonah Metzger.
No, it was in the between 93 and
So is Rabbi Lau, probably.
Yeah.
And now his son, Rabbi David Lau, he's now the chief rabbi.
But that was,
And he's Rabbi Lau, the original Rabbi Lau Senior. He's the rabbi of Tel Aviv, chief rabbi of Tel Aviv. That's a fantastic story.
That's all I do in Judaism, except come to these things.
You wear tefillin every day? Fantastic. So the groups like the Sadducees, they only believed in a written Torah, which ironically is impossible because, take the example of tefillin. Tefillin says wear tefillin. More precisely, it's wear totafot. It doesn't tell you what it looks like. Right? So if you just take the written document, you'll have a very conflicted, or like you won't know what to do because the book itself is clearly an imperfect document on its own. We're totafot. What does totafot mean? What does it look like? Right. So ironically, they have to develop their own oral Torah, their own oral traditions. So it's actually not possible to have it without an oral tradition. So what's ironic, you have I think there's still one Karaite temple. There's like 10,000 Karaites still left. We think of the Karaites as an afterthought, but in the 9th century, a third of Jewish people were Karaites. It was hugely popular.
Where were they? Were they everywhere? Were they in Israel?
It must have been either in Europe or.
I didn't know anything about him. I don't know he was on American Idol or something. There was a Karaite Jew who came in like second or third.
Yeah, there's a temple. There's in Los Angeles. There's one, but it's dead. It's dead. But it was hugely popular, and but it's impossible to have a practice of Judaism without an Oral Torah, because like I said, tefillin doesn't say what tefillin is.
Or slaughter, kosher slaughter.
Kosher slaughter. It's a great example because in Deuteronomy chapter.
It says specifically, do it in the way that I've told
Exactly.
you. Exactly. Write it down anywhere. Yeah.
Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 21.
Yeah.
It talks about when you want to eat food, not in a sacrifice setting, but you want to eat food because you want to have a burger, right? So you slaughter it the way as I instructed. And if you look everywhere throughout the whole written document, it doesn't say anywhere how the Almighty instructed it. So obviously there was some instruction.
The body of knowledge separate.
That's right. So that's one of the classical proofs from the actual written document that there's some other oral instruction.
Is the man that does that ritual slaughter, is he called a shloshet?
Shochet.
Say it again?
Shochet.
Shochet. Thank you.
No need to gesture on yourself.
Oh, is that what you did?
Well, I couldn't think of how to explain it, and that is like so clear.
So that's one example. Another example is at the end of the book of Mishpatim, where it talks about Amalek. It says, "Kso zos b'sefer v'sim ba'osnei Yoshua." The Almighty instructs Moses, write this in a book and tell it in the ears of Joshua. So we see this duality of this multiple instructions in a written document, but also in an oral instruction. Now remember, not only is it written in the book itself that there is an oral component to it, like the example I brought, and not only is it impossible to actually understand what it is that you have to do unless there's an oral component, like we said, like what does it mean? Observe the Shabbos, don't do any work.
Well, what does that mean?
What is what?
You can't kindle fire.
Well, kindle fire is the only one that it says explicitly. But it says don't do work. And now the Talmud says, well, it says that right next to, juxtaposed to the requirement of building the temple, right? Build a temple. Don't do building the temple on Shabbat. That's what it says. Build a temple. Don't do work on Shabbat. Build a temple. Don't do the building the temple on Shabbat. So it's indicating by juxtaposition that anything that is required to build a temple
Should not be done.
is not done on Shabbat. That's why if you open up the book of Shabbat, in the oral law, when it was written down, it talks all about where these 39 categories of work, how they applied in the temple. You know, part of the temple was baking bread. So anything involved with baking bread from the sowing of the field and the planting and the watering and the harvesting and right till the actual baking, all that is part of what exactly.
You didn't say how they wrote down the oral law when the Torah says you shouldn't write down.
So that's an example of overlooking one small principle of Judaism to save Judaism in its entirety.
Does it say in the written Torah not to write it down?
Today you can.
Well, it's
Where's that come from?
the Talmud at Gittin brings a verse. I don't remember the exact verse. I can get that for you if you would like.
I'm just curious.
Yeah.
Yeah,
The-
because I would lean towards, if it doesn't say in the written Torah that you can't write down the oral Torah, then why not write down the oral Torah?
Yes. But remember, there's okay. So this is another important point. Okay, we're
There's
getting so
words for
sidetracked.
that, like
Deoraita.
mispronounced it,
Deoraita.
but you know what words I'm talking about.
Oraita is the Aramaic word for Torah.
And then
So deoraita, which means from the Torah. So like when we talk about a mitzvah, a commandment that's from the Torah versus let's say rabbinic edict, one will be called deoraita from the Torah, and one will be derabanan from the rabbis, right? Because the rabbis are instructed with putting a fence around the Torah. So that's why the rabbis say don't handle a pen on Shabbat because a pen is only used for one thing, and that's a prohibited act on Shabbat, writing. So that would be a rabbinic prohibition, you know. But why was it oral to begin with? You know, this is a great question. Just write it down. Isn't that simpler? Isn't that a better way to ensure that it will not be corrupted?
It's a lot of scrolls to haul around the desert, though.
Well, yes,
Well, they
okay.
would have been a nomadic people, so
I mean, if you're constantly traveling,
you're
you're not going
constantly
to write down
traveling,
every
yeah.
detail.
Unless Moses would write it down. Remember, all the oral Torah we say is an oral Torah from Moses, right? From Sinai. What were they doing at Sinai? They were studying Torah. What kind of Torah? They didn't have the written Torah all the way to the end, right? At the weeks before Moses died is when he actually gave the Jewish people the actual scrolls. What happened till then was that they were studying Torah. Well, what were they studying? They were studying the oral Torah. What it means to be Jewish, you know? What it means to wear tzitzit, you know? What it
they
means.
also they heard it in their own language.
Well, they heard what they heard. They heard the Ten Commandments. Ten Commandments are just the principles, right? Maybe the foundations of the whole Torah, but not the actual applications of all the mitzvahs and all the particular aspects of all the mitzvahs. That was all given by oral instruction. But why was it oral? Just write it down. So there's a few answers. Number one, if it's written down, then it's in the hands of Gentiles. And as we'll see later on, when the Torah was actually translated, the Septuagint is considered a day of tragedy in the Jewish people. When the Ptolemy, the second, right, invited, with quotation marks, or more precisely, forced 70 rabbis individually to write down the Torah in Greek, the first translation of the Torah. It's a day of tragedy. Why? Now the Gentiles will use the Torah against us. Until this day, people say, oh, the Torah says this, the Torah says that, and once it's in the hands of the Gentiles, they can use it against us. Additionally, the Torah is kind of the verse at the end of Deuteronomy, right? Torah tzivalanu Moshe morashati hilat Yaakov. Torah was instructed us by Moses. It is a birthright of the Jewish people. It's ours, right? It's not meant for the whole world. We have a universal vision, but the Torah is instruction to the Jewish people. It's not for everyone. You want to join the Jewish people? You're welcome. Right? We embrace converts, and we have throughout history. But the Torah itself is for Jews. But the real most important reason why we kept Torah oral was because that is the best way, or having this duality of an oral and a written Torah, it's the best way to ensure that the whole corpus of Jewish knowledge will be transmitted accurately. How so? If you have documented, everyone here who here went to some form of higher learning after high school? Everyone went to college here, some sort. Everyone went to school. Why do you go to school? Just learn from. Why don't you just do University of Phoenix online?
They didn't have that.
Oh, they didn't have that. Okay, but the reason why you go to school and you hear from an instructor, because an instructor, oral instruction is much more effective in actually communicating the principles than reading from the book. Why? Because first of all, there's no inflection. It's interactive. There's dialogue, right? If I say, I always do this example. I don't know if I did this exercise with you guys. Just this exercise. If you have done it, then just stop me in my tracks. I'm going to tell you guys a sentence. You guys tell me what it means. Ready? Did I do this with you, or? I didn't. I guess I did it.
I can just see how it's going to go wrong. But go ahead.
I did not hit my wife. What does that mean? I did it with you guys?
Yes.
Yeah, we did that.
Oh, we did it. Okay. We didn't?
That means you didn't hit her, but you probably...
Whoa. No. If I said I did not hit my wife, it means that I didn't hit my wife. That's what it means. But if I said I didn't hit my wife, it means
Someone else is
I didn't hit my wife.
Oh, I see what you mean.
means you kicked her.
I didn't hit my wife.
It means you hit somebody else's wife.
I just gave you the same words, but with an oral instruction, you have the ability of inflection, you have the ability of that dialogue, and then you're able to just communicate much more.
It gives you context.
Now remember, the written Torah is there to ensure that if your oral tradition doesn't fit with the written Torah, then it's discarded. So the written Torah is kind of like the framework, like the lecture notes of the actual instruction. But if your instruction doesn't fit in to the written law, the rigid written law, then it has to be discarded because you made a mistake. Because there can never be an incompatibility between the oral Torah and the written Torah. It has to work together, and theoretically, if you just have the written Torah and the rules for deriving the written Torah, right, the 13th principle of deduction and derivation, I don't know if that's even a word. Derivation, thank you. It is a word, thank you. Those principles, you're actually able to take the whole Torah and derive from it all the laws. So actually the oral Torah is contained within the written Torah as well. It's there, but it's not obvious unless you have the tools to deduce it. So what we have is that we're able to take the oral Torah as a tradition, plug it back into the written Torah, and actually see how it comes from the written Torah as well. Right? By the 13 principles. This is also a very fascinating topic. There's 13 principles of derivation and deduction from the written Torah. Like if it says a rule, a general rule, and then it has a specific, and then it has an additional rule. So if you have, let's say, a inclusive statement, and then a exclusive statement, followed by an inclusive statement. So there's a whole. So then, what is it? Is it inclusive? Is it exclusive? So what the rule is that it's inclusive, provided that it's similar to the exception, to the exclusive statement. That's an example of klal uprat ukala. You have a general statement, specific statement, then another general statement. Then yes, it applies everywhere, provided that in the model of the example that is in the exclusive example. Sorry if I'm boring you guys with.
Constitutional law.
Yes, basically very similar to
exactly what it is.
Yes, very similar. Just much more exhaustive. Much more exhaustive, and no need of many modifications. Oh, where were we? Okay, so let's talk about kind of the world at large. So we have the internal challenges the Jewish people are going to face. We have this expanded Sanhedrin, men of the Great Assembly. They're going to try to create a Judaism that's going to survive. What's happened in the greater world is that during the First Temple, we had to contend with the great Eastern empires of Assyria, of Babylon, of Persia, and now we're going to have to deal with the great Western empires of Greece, and then the mother of all empires, Rome. Greece or the Greeks, Greek life, Greek culture, and Judaism had actually a lot in common, and on the other hand, were diametrically opposite. And you look at the Talmud, where Talmud talks about Yavan, or Greece, it kind of has like mixed messages. On one hand, we're told that there's no the verse in the Torah, Yav Elokim liyefet v'yishton. Beauty is to Yefet. Yefet is the forebearer of Yavan. Beauty is for Yefet v'yishton ba'olei Shem, and will dwell in the house of Shem, which is Israel. We have this relationship of this beauty of the Greeks, but we have we accept the beauty of the Greeks in a certain context of the tense of Shem. We're told in the Talmud that there's only one language aside from Hebrew where that a Torah scroll is kosher in, and that's the language of Greek. The Talmud lauds the beauty of Greek culture, Greek life, and the Greek perspective on things. And we know the Greeks were very similar to the Jews, that they had an interest in knowledge. They were fascinated by philosophy. We know Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. These are titans of philosophy, and we were like, the one brilliant kid who is surrounded by idiots. That's what we were basically compared to our neighbors throughout history, until we meet the Greeks. And this is a nation, and the Greeks also, conversely, they see the Jewish people. Jewish people are like universal literacy. Obsessed with law and knowledge and philosophy, has a way of thinking, a universal vision. That's what they saw with the Jewish people. So they had a lot in common on one hand. On the other hand, the Greeks and the Jewish people had diametrically opposite views of the world. The Greeks were famous not only for conquering, we'll get to that with Alexander the Great, the greatest, probably the greatest military genius and conqueror in human history. I don't think there's really much of a match anywhere else. In 10 years, basically took over the whole world. 10 years, that's it. He died at the age of 32. 32, he was dead. At the age of 20, he was already the emperor and just kind of took it over. And I don't know what I was just about to say. Alexander the Great. Oh, and when they did conquest, it wasn't just about conquering land. It was also about instilling a way of life, the Greek way of life, which is also, we say, similar to the way the Romans did it. The Romans are the natural heirs to the Greeks in the way of thinking, the way of seeing the world. So what they would do is not only take over a nation and let it exist as it was previously, but rather they would try to instill it with their way of thinking, Greek culture, which is called Hellenism. Excellent. What is Hellenism? To put it briefly, we would say that Hellenism is a worldview where the human is at the center. Humanism, basically, which would be revived much later in history. And that is the idea of the beauty, number one, of man, the intelligence of man, the body of man, the idea of focusing on who you are and your body and all the Greek physicality and all the Greek structures that we see today, like all super chiseled. Everyone's like, the might, and everyone's throwing discuses around. They make this gymnasium. The word gymnasium is from the word is gymnos, which means naked. Everything that they did, it was just, because to them, nothing was more beautiful than the human body. And all their sporting events were held in the nude, because to them that was a beautiful thing. And for us Jews, the very first mitzvah that we have in the Torah is circumcision, and this is something to them which is to them the human body is sacrosanct, and it's beautiful and sacrosanct. For us, we say that the soul is sacrosanct. The body is a vessel for the soul. Right? To them, everything that is beautiful, everything that is beautiful in your body, that is the final. That's the end. For us, yes, we embrace physicality. We're not ascetic, right? We don't believe in self-denial. That's not a Jewish ideal. We embrace the beauty of Yefet, provided it's within a certain context, with a certain perspective of a soul. So we say that we have an internal aspect that they don't have. If you look at the word, the Hebrew word for Greek or Greece, anyone knows what that is? Yavan. The word Yavan. How do you spell that? A Yud, which is a straight line, a Vav, which is also a straight line, a little bit longer, and a Nun Sofit, which is even a straighter line. Yeah. In the Jewish worldview, Greece is organized, it's beautiful, but it has no internalness. Nothing within it. Just, it's all external. You take the word Yavan, you turn it backwards, you have the word Noi. Noi means beauty. Right? That's what they are. It's something beautiful, something fascinating, but they kind of missed the boat. And they also had this. They to them, the Greeks also obsessed with philosophy, right? Right. And they kind of felt that they met somewhat of their intellectual counterparts within the Jewish people, and this kind of tension that began with the Greeks kind of trying to spread their culture throughout the world, but it would reach a certain crescendo, like in the 2nd century before the Common Era. So we think about it, Greece now. They're about to conquer the world, and they're going to spread this way of life. And in a couple of hundred years, it's going to actually be a cause of tremendous strife within the Jewish people. They're going to have a civil war, like crazy stuff. We're going to have, obviously, the Maccabean revolt as a way of kind of pushing what would become the Seleucid Greeks, the Assyrian Greeks, getting rid of them, getting rid of the way of life, and kind of reestablishing the Jewish way of life and Jewish sovereignty over Israel. It's ironic, irony of all ironies.
When the Jews conquered, whatever they conquered, did they force conversion?
No, Jews, well, I think there might have been some times where there was forced proselytization, but remember, that's against Jewish law. So the Idumeans, we'll see them later, right? Herod, remember Herod the Great? He would be the Roman proxy over procurator, I think the word, fancy word is. Roman procurator, which is like basically the Roman emissary to control Judea. He wasn't really technically Jewish. He was from the Idumeans. There's a lot of tension between him.
Wasn't he a convert, though?
So yes, but it was a convert of questionable legitimacy.
Oh.
So he tried to bolster his legitimacy by intermarrying with the Hasmoneans. They tried to claim it, stake his claim to Jewish royalty. So yes, there were some examples, but those are the exceptions. Because remember, we don't force conversion; it's against Jewish law. We don't believe that you have to be Jewish to be good. We don't believe that Judaism is for everyone. We believe that whoever wants to join is welcome, but it's not. We don't force it. So back to the Greeks for a second. Irony of all ironies. Yeah. In Israel, and even here, the Maccabees, a term for the Israeli sports teams. The Israelis that participate in the Olympics, which is a modern revival of Hellenism, the Israelis call their team the Maccabees, when the Maccabees themselves, they came to reject that way of life. Yeah. The Maccabees were the family of Maccabee is an acronym for Mi Kamocho Be'elim Hashem, who is like you amongst God, like Hashem, our God. And that was the rallying cry of the family and eventually the movements that rejected Hellenism and kicked the Assyrian Greeks out. And, like, very ironic, a twist of irony, that's the actual name of what's, the Israelis or the Jewish participation in Olympic events. They call them Maccabees. So, yes, ironies. So we have Greece, and ancient Greece was, we know the city-states, Athens and Sparta, always fighting with each other. centers of culture, of architecture and art and philosophy and drama and all those things. We say Athens is kind of like was the epicenter of that, and Sparta were all the warriors, and they take the kids at the age of 7, and they could train them to be soldiers, and they would deprive them of food and force them to steal, basically create these rugged warriors. They were always battling within each other. Eventually, a guy by the name of Philip unites Greece. He had conquest and diplomacy and force of personality, that he eventually was able to, the Persians, which were at that time the major world empire, they were trying to overcome the Greeks, and eventually, like the big famous Battle of the Marathon, where they were able to repel the Persians, and they're attacking the Greeks. And eventually, Philip is assassinated. There are those that say he was assassinated by his son, Alexander. And Alexander was the one who is going to begin this decade of conquest, unparalleled in human history. And what he basically did in these 10 years was completely disassemble the entire Persian Empire. Persian Empire dominated the entire world, basically. And he was a crazy tactician. He was also out of his mind. He was a maniac. Like he didn't sit in the back. Alexander, he didn't sit in the back and give instructions. He went ahead with everyone. He never lost a battle. Never lost. And he developed, we know the Greeks, they had their phalanxes. So they developed a pitched warfare, as opposed to ancient warfare was very highly ritualized. It had our warrior versus your warrior, like the story of David and Goliath, which is basically he had representatives to kind of fight it out. The Greek method of warfare was they were all carrying lots of armory, lots of heavy machinery, really long spears, really organized, short battles. Heavy casualties, lots of hacking, lots of really trying to break the center, the strong point. They would always go for the strong point of the enemies. Really short battles and move on. So, Alexander, great warrior, great genius, military genius, super ego. He is taking over the world. Every place he goes, he starts a city called Alexandria. We'll see that the famous Alexandria in Egypt actually had a enormous Jewish population over the next hundreds of years. In fact, the Talmud tells us of this synagogue in Alexandria that it was so large that when someone said the bracha on the Torah, someone said the blessing on the Torah, no one was able to hear them. They would have to wave like a handkerchief so people would know when to respond with the amens. It was enormous. So that's Alexandria. And the Talmud tells us this great story about Alexander's conquest of Israel, of Jerusalem. It was the only time, I think, in history where Jerusalem was captured without a battle. What happened? Or without any bloodshed of any sort. This is Talmud in Yoma 69a. It says Alexander came to Jerusalem, and the way it was is, with Alexander, and especially the pragmatic leaders. So remember Shimon. Remember we talked about Shimon outside Shimon the Just, who was the last of the men of the great assemblies. He was the leader of the Jewish people at the time. So the pragmatic Jewish leaders always know that if you have, let's say, Rome or Greece coming to conquer, we don't necessarily want to pick fights. To us, it's more important to not lose tens of thousands in massacres to try to maintain our nationhood, but rather to we can have a nation living under someone else, provided that we're safe and we have the ability to practice our religion with freedom, and which was the Greeks would almost exactly. So he came out to greet Alexander. This is what the Talmud tells the story. And Alexander got off his horse and bowed to him. So, and his general said, Alexander's bowed to no one. He's super eager and bowed to no one. Why is he bowing down to Shimon? It's not Shimon just. And the Talmud says that he told his generals that every night before his battle, he he has a dream and he sees this guy, and then he's encouraged he's going to win. And that's why he captured Jerusalem, and there was no battle whatsoever. Now, is this story, is it true, is it not, is it historical? I don't think that's really relevant. But what we do see is, we know for sure that Alexander's conquest of Jerusalem was done without a battle. There's no battle that we have recorded. And that he was very favorable to the Jews. And in fact, we know that the name Alexander is a Jewish name. The Talmud says that as a result of his peaceful conquest of Jerusalem, they pledged that all Jewish boys born subsequently in the upcoming year would be called Alexander. So the name Alexander or Sender is a Jewish name till this day as a result of that. Interestingly, we see after that event, we see that a lot of Jewish people adopting Greek names. So it was a very popular thing. Perhaps there are those that theorize that as a result of them kind of opening the can of worms to, say, we'll name all our kids Alexander. They said, okay, we can name other Greek names are fine as well. So we see from then on, just Jews with Greek names was ubiquitous.
Rabbi, we're about to get deluged with young children.
Deluged with young children.
Very soon, they'll be trickling in.
Okay, so let me just wrap up, and we'll know where we're up to here.
Okay.
Alexander dies on the year 323 before the Common Era. His empire was so vast, he never actually made it back to Macedonia. He went all the way to India, and just relentless conquest. Everyone, he had a mutiny amongst his followers, amongst his generals. They wanted to go home after this so much battle. He dies from some sort of an exotic disease. No one really knows what he died from, but his life of he was a famous womanizer, and his life of debauchery was I guess very famous, and it's kind of not surprising he died of some sort of exotic disease. Either way, what's going to happen now is that his empire was so vast that there was no personality that was kind of big enough or great enough or powerful enough or compelling enough to kind of control that. And what you eventually have is basically three separate empires: the Macedonian or Greek proper empire in Greece, the Ptolemaic or Egyptian empire in the south, Ptolemy, and the Assyrian or the Seleucid empire in Assyria, basically in further east. So in what we call Persia, Iran, and Iraq, Syria, that's where it was centered. Sandwiched between all of this is Judah. So what we're going to have over the next couple hundred years, we're going to have tremendous infighting between the Ptolemites and the Seleucids, and we're always going to be ping-ponged back. In Israel, we're going to be ping-ponged back between being controlled by the Seleucids or the Ptolemites, or Ptolemies, however you pronounce it. And the first 120, 30 years after the death of Alexander and the breakup, fragmentation of his empire, we're going to be controlled by the Ptolemites, and then in the year 198, in the Battle of the Banyas, we're going to be controlled by the Seleucids, and the Seleucids are when we're going to meet the Antiochus III, Antiochus IV, and the whole Hanukkah story is going to happen in the year 167 before the Common Era, and we meet the Hasmoneans and take us all the way to Herod. So that's what we're up to. I really wanted to cover everything, but unfortunately, it's not going to happen. But I feel we covered a lot.
Can we keep going?
Yeah, we will. No, we're going to stop. We have
Okay,
of course. So then we're going to do another week, at least one more week before the end of the year. We're going to combine two other classes. Dan is going to send out the schedules, and we're going to start from, I guess, the Hanukkah story, and we'll try to do it a little faster. But it's kind of, the way they say crash courses typically crash. Doesn't really work out the way it's intended. So yes, the hope is that I tried. I really wanted.
When you go so fast, though, you lose a lot of the context.
Of course,
You
but
lose
that's
a lot of the minutia that's really interesting.
that's very fascinating.
It's fascinating.
Yeah, this all this is very fascinating and really important.
Are we going to get to talk about Sephardic Jewish culture at all?
Yeah, why not?
countries, because I mean, obviously, it's going to be a big deal. Spain will be a big deal.
Oh, yeah,
and
Spain's
we'll
huge.
have, you know,
We talked about it a lot
Maimonides
when we talked
and-
about Maimonides. Yeah.
So what do you recommend as the best single volume text on the history of the Jewish
I
people?
would say the best single text.
I love Joseph
Well, Talishman doesn't really have a history book, a single volume. The best probably is A History of the Jews by Paul Johnson. But he's a
By Paul Johnson.
A History of the Jews by Paul Johnson. He's probably the number one most respected historian. He wrote like 78 books or 92 books. The guy's just incredible. Paul Johnson.
The rabbi that did that crash course on Jewish history. It's at the Jewish
Yes,
website.
Yes, so I like I like A Crash Course in Jewish History by Rabbi Ken Spiro, because he also gives you kind of a perspective, a Jewish perspective, kind of traditional Jewish perspective. But it's much shorter. It doesn't give you the minutia. Depends what you want. If you want a lot more details and also like a secular perspective, you want to for sure go with Paul Johnson, A History of the Jews. He does a great job, but remember, he's Christian, so he has his perspective. But every historian has their own perspective. No one's really truly objective. No one is. Besides from me, of course. But so he has Paul Johnson has his kind of his perspective on like what the Jewish God is, and so I would tell you to skip like the first 50 pages where he talks about like what the Jewish God means. Just go to the history. Don't give us your opinion. Let's shift the fact. He does a very good job with the fact, not such a good job with opinion. And Ken Spiro, does a fantastic job in his crash course in Jewish history.
You can hit that jewishpathways.com and
He has that. Is that right?
yeah,
You can order it.
log in and sign up for that class.
Oh, you can. Yeah, you might be able to read it online or portions of it online.
These little video clips there.
And Barrel Wine, that's not a single volume, but Barrel Wine is also a probably the most respected Jewish historian. Probably, he's fantastic. Berel, also a fascinating character. He's still around, but he's a fantastic historian and does a really good job of that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Yes, thank you all. See you all not next week, but the week after. Whoever does not have a copy of this, we really want to fill out another tape.